Hey, good people. This week we are going to be reviewing information found in Chapter 3, which addresses poverty, and Chapter 7, which talks about work and the changes, I should say, in the labor market. So let's go ahead and get started. When we talk about poverty and we're looking at poverty, we have to be mindful that poverty can be defined in two different ways. And this is information that's kind of towards the middle or the end of Chapter 3. When we talk about defining poverty, we can look at it based on absolute poverty or relative poverty. Excuse me. When we talk about absolute poverty, we are defining something as being life-threatening. We're looking at poverty as if we do not have access to life-sustaining needs. When we're talking about relative poverty is in comparison to a standard that is in existence based on our current environment. So we have absolute poverty and relative poverty. When we're talking about poverty, as we see in the textbook, the book kind of breaks things down and introduces us to this perspective of the individual's perspective on poverty, as well as a structural explanation on poverty. When we're looking at it from an individual's perspective on poverty, there are several things that we need to that we need to explore, whether it is a decline in family values, looking at relationships or family structures, looking at society, government input. All of that has a bearing on individual poverty, as well as when we start to break it down and look at it from structural explanations of poverty. When we talk about structural explanations of poverty, this is where we take a look at things, and we have to get this understanding about the different elements within society that factor into the idea or the concept or the element of poverty. Now, I did post a video in this week's module that I really want you guys to make sure that you view, and it is a TEDx presentation that's being made, and it is entitled The Inheritance of Poverty. And I really need you all to think about that, because as we're talking about poverty and we look at some of the issues relative to poverty, we have to also examine this whole idea of social mobility. Excuse me. When we talk about social mobility, we know that there is a high level of social mobility, meaning that there is an opportunity for people to move from one social class to another social class, looking at their success. Let's say that they are able to achieve material success, they're able to achieve some type of movement in this social mobility, or I should say in the social ladder in our society. And then when we talk about it, we look at the low mobility, that low level of social mobility, it kind of reminds us of the whole idea of a caste system where people are defined by their social class that they are born into, and there is no movement or relatively little movement from or within that social class. So we have high social mobility as well as, excuse me, as well as low social mobility. But let me go back real quick, good people, and before I get into talking a little bit about the mobility, because I want to look at also something that the book explains to us. And the book talks about, or ask the question, why is there so much poverty and inequality in the United States? And I really want you just to pause for a moment and just think about how you would address that question. Excuse me. Now, the book addresses it in a way that it breaks down three specific areas. We're breaking down income, wealth, and net financial assets. Now, I really want you to sit down and want you to pause and think about that. Income, wealth, and net financial assets. And then I want you to ask yourselves, do we really have equal opportunity, excuse me, or an egalitarian society here in the United States? How does our social functioning and our social economic status, how does it compare from a global perspective? We know that inequality and poverty is on the increase, and it continues to rise. And our book talks about several reasons why we see a rise in inequality within our society, one of which we look at as technology. One is the decline in manufacturing. Well, and when we talk about technology, we can see that by, excuse me, how with the increase, I shouldn't say the decline of technology, but the changes of technology, with the increases of improvements in technology. We see a decline in employment and people being able to maintain some types of jobs because it is replaced by technology. When we look at it from based on a decline of manufacturing, now I need you to think about it from this perspective, good people. Think about our general area, our service area. We could say at this central Pennsylvania area, and we know that within this area, in generations gone by, we have been known for coal industry as well as steel industry. And what happened in this area? Little history lesson and a little bit of history research, I should say. What happened in this area in the 80s going into the 90s, where we started to see a decrease in coal and also in steel. And how did that impact, again, the folks that are living in this area? The third thing that the book talks about when we look at inequality being on the increase, when we're looking at poverty, excuse me, is from a global perspective. And when we're looking at it from a global perspective, some of the things that we think about the impact here at home is we see an outsourcing of jobs that used to be held here within the United States that are now being outsourced foreignly, or I should say internationally. How does that impact, again, our financial status and our social classes here in the United States? The fourth thing that the book talks about is government policy. Now, before anybody gets on their high horse about government policy, let's talk about it. And I want you to think about it a little bit. How is the government movement impacting or affecting poverty within the United States? Not how can we fix it, but how is it impacting? One of the things that the book talks about is, this whole battle with increasing minimum wage. So those, again, some of the things, some of the issues, the topics when we look at the whole concept of poverty here in the United States. Now, as I said briefly before, when we're thinking about poverty and socioeconomic status or socioeconomic class, we have that high social mobility and low social mobility. When we're thinking about that social mobility, automatically this kind of puts us into a perspective where we're thinking about, or we start to examine some of the factors that contribute to social mobility. And one of the big things that we have to consider, and it's something that's written in our textbook, is education. Education and social mobility. Now, I need you to put on your thinking caps, good people, and I want you to think about how you see, or maybe some of the influences that you have noticed, maybe some of the experiences that you've had when we consider education and social mobility. How is that played out in our area? How do we see that played out nationally? There's another video that I have posted, again, in this module that I want you to watch. And that video, again, is a TEDx presentation. And that one is all about how America's public schools keeps children in poverty. I'm not saying all public schools are bad. I'm not saying that at all. But we have to begin to examine, what is it that education contributes, or what is it that is lacking in education when we begin to think about social mobility, again, talking about impoverished areas, people that may be living in poverty. So again, poverty, absolute poverty, relative poverty, some of the factors relating to that, looking at education and poverty. As we look at education and poverty, we get to this place where we begin thinking about, what is some of the harm that may be experienced, or what is some of the harm that poverty causes to two segments of our population that we know their voices are not as powerful as what they could be when we talk about change. That would be our children and our elderly. Excuse me. So when we think about poverty and children, we know, as we already talked about, the impact of education. When we think about poverty and our aging population, there's a lot that goes along with that, good people. Poverty and our aging population, we know that we are currently in a position within our society where we have a large, or I should say a growing baby boomer population. So we have a large population of the elderly, of people getting older, living longer. And so what does that mean for them with their financial status. What does that mean for them when we have folks that are at this place where in generations gone by, it may have been the ideal age for retirement, but now they're at a place where I don't know if I can retire. What happens for them? We're going to get into that in chapter 7 when we talk about work and the changing work environment. But right now, when we look at poverty, how does that impact, again, our children as well as our aging population? The final thing that I want to look at, just brief overview in chapter 3 when we talk about poverty, is this final question. What can we do? What can we do to address poverty? Is there anything that we can do? If there is something that can be done, how can we make it equal across the board? One of the things that the book talks about, excuse me, is the possible expansion of the welfare state. Now, hold on, y'all, hold on. I can hear somebody sighing and I see eyes rolling. When we talk about an expansion of the welfare state, we're not talking just about public assistance. Now, I need you to wrap your brains around this, good people. When we're thinking about the welfare state, we're talking about all of the financial assistance that stems from from the federal government. Yes, that includes public assistance, but it also includes Social Security, supplemental security income. It includes our retirement. All of these things are included when we're thinking about, and of course, also I forgot our earned income tax credits for children. These are things that are encompassing or that are included when we talk about the welfare state. So how do we approach things where we begin to consider the government's perspective, the government's level of participation, when we're thinking about how we can address poverty and inequality in our country? So the book talks a little bit about a universal health insurance. We know about that. We have something like that already going on, but what are some of the tweaks, the perks, the hurdles that come along with that? We also have this continued conversation about increasing minimum wage. How are we going to do that so that we address not just the needs of those who may be working in a minimum wage position, but also what does that mean for the economy overall when we increase minimum wage? And again, the last one that I want to bring up real quickly is government jobs. What happens with our government job programs, our employment programs, when we're looking at trying to supplement or trying to provide on-the-job training or commercial training for those who may currently be unemployed or seeking employment, or coming straight out of an educational institution. So when we're thinking about poverty, there's a big rainbow, I guess I should say, or a big overarching issue of how can we address poverty in the United States? And what does poverty mean from the individual's perspective, as well as from a structural perspective? With that being said, we're going to move right into chapter 7, exploring work and changes in the labor market. When looking at work and changes in the labor market, let's just jump right in head first, good people, because one thing that is glaring overall with this particular chapter, as it starts out talking about unemployment, is that currently the state that our country is in, due to the pandemic that we have been experiencing, is that there is a great increase in an unemployment rate within our country. And before the pandemic, we experienced issues with unemployment, as well as underemployment. Now, when we're talking about unemployment, our book just gives us a really brief introduction to the survey that is generally used to collect employment and unemployment data. That survey is referred to as the Current Population Survey. And they ask and focus on two very specific questions. The first question is, do you have a job? And the second question is, are you currently looking for a job? With these questions, this is kind of what is used to determine our unemployment levels in our country. So when we're talking about unemployment in our country, the book kind of just leads naturally into this question, and I found it kind of interesting, is why is employment necessary? Why is it necessary to have a job? Well, I think we can all answer that question, why it's necessary to have a job. First and foremost, because of being able to meet our daily needs. and also being able to feel some of the desires based on a material culture that we may be living in. Most importantly, some of the things that we look at when we're talking about why it's important to have a job is also because based on our health care, our health needs. So when we think about, excuse me, why it's important to have a job, we also have to look at what's been going on that we've been seeing a decrease or a disappearance of employment, a disappearance of long-term employment. And so now let's take that question in that perspective and let's look at things here locally, or I should say within our area. When we think about the decrease um, in employment, again, as I talked about earlier, back in the 80s and the 90s, we saw a vast decrease or an interruption, an ending of an era, maybe I should say, when we think about the steel mills as well as the coal industry. When we consider all of these things, um, the decrease in employment and how that impacts an area, there's a lot of stuff that goes on with that. We have mental health issues. We have quality of health issues. And again, as I'm naming these, I really want you to think about this particular service area, our service area. When we talk about mental health issues, when we talk about our quality of health issues, when we talk about family and family structure, family arrangements, when we talk about the strain on a marriage and on relationships, and when we look at also how this unemployment, underemployment, how it impacts academic success of our children. All of these things, good people, it starts to factor into some of the things that we see happening when we consider changes that are taking place due to employment within our country. Now, before I go on with that, I'm just going to take a pause for a moment right here. And I really need you to think about within this area, maybe consider it from your family's perspective, maybe extended family, maybe friends of the families. How have you seen um, employment, underemployment, and unemployment impact the way the family system functions here in our area? What does that mean for the individual in our area? When we talk about that mental health, we really got to think about what are some of the consequences when we're looking at mental health, the struggle with mental health. One big consequence that we could say we could attribute or that we can apply maybe to the issue of unemployment could be substance use and substance abuse in this area. Although during the time of the pandemic, we did not hear much news reported on that, we know that that's still a very big issue in this area. When we think about the education and how it impacts children and their academic performance, we can see that as we get information laid out, not just from an academic perspective with how our local schools are performing, but when we look at it from a statewide perspective and we begin to compare and contrast the rate of our student success from the Pennsylvania Youth Survey here in Cambria County versus Blair County versus Somerset County versus Clarion, all of these different surrounding areas, how do we see it played out? Now, when we get there and we recognize that there is a change, a disappearing of long-term employment, we get to this place where the book begins to talk about and asks us, how do we see our lives changing based on the changes in the work structure and in demands of the work structure? Some of the ways that we see those changes are we may see folks that have an increase in the hours that they are at work. Gone are the days where you have a 40-hour work week and you're finished. Excuse me. There are some folks that may need to work longer than the 40-hour work week, and it's considered a regular work week, not overtime, but it's just a regular work week. We also see this whole idea of a younger workforce where people are starting to go to work at a younger age. Now, hear what I'm saying. Yes, there was a time in generations gone by when children, yes, based on the family structure and the family location, children were expected to work and not go to school. And I'm talking about maybe in rural areas where we had large families and children worked on the family farm. Excuse me, but when we're talking about children in the workforce right now, we're looking at children who are leaving high school. And I'm not going to my team practice, I'm not going to any extracurricular activities, but I'm leaving high school and I'm going to work. Why is that? We also have some programs where some students, as they go through high school, some students, sometimes in their junior and senior year of high school, may have the opportunity of just going to school for half a day, and then they go to work for the other half. Why is that? Why are we having those types of changes? The last change that I want to bring up when we talk about our changes in the labor market here within our current society is kind of what I touched on a little bit from chapter 3 when we talk about our aging population. We have a growing aging population, and we see folks that, or I should say, we see the impact of things going on with our government that impact our growing aging population needing to stay employed beyond that time of retirement. So they get to a place where they have to have a job. How do we see that played out? How do we see the impact of that? Locally, I think we could say we see that in some local markets as well as some nationally known markets. We see a growing aging population, growing older people working as cashiers, working as baggers or stalkers, working in other industry areas. Why is that necessary? All of that is discussed in chapter 7. So again, good people, there's 2 videos that are posted that I really want you to take the opportunity to view, 2 TED Talk videos. And there's also going to be additional information posted in Revel that I want you to make sure that you watch those videos as well. There are going to be discussion questions as well as other areas of interest and assignments posted on the college's LMS. All right, good people, poverty and changes in the workforce or changes in the labor market. That's chapter 3 and chapter 7. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, y'all know how to get a hold of me by email or by phone. And until the next time, I bid you love, peace, and bacon grease. Y'all have a great day.